I want to welcome everyone to our program today. I talked with author and illustrator Nora Krug, who wrote a fantastic book, Belonging, German. Now I didn't write the title down, and now I'm too nervous to remember it, but you're going to hear a lot about it. And so I just want to say my name is Mark McGuigan. As many of you know, I'm the president currently of the German Society of Pennsylvania. And we are really thrilled to have Nora and also Maiken Scott from WHYY here with us today to have this conversation. This is the fourth in a series of programs that we've been doing on German Jewish heritage. We cleverly named it the German Jewish Heritage Series, just to confuse everyone. And you might say it's the fifth program because sort of the thing that we have right here is for the Lehr Beck Institute. It's a small exhibit that looks at 1,700 years of German Jewish life. And I want to invite you this afternoon to take a look at it because tomorrow it goes away. And this will be the last opportunity to see it here. But a wonderful project, the Shared History Project by our partners, the German Jewish Historical Association and Archive, the Lehr Beck Institute. You can also see there's more online information if you use the rather obvious QR codes that they have installed. For those of us who are a little bit behind the times, they want to make it obvious that they're there. And there's more information on this project online at their website. I also want to just say that although this is the last currently scheduled program in this series, more are coming. And so we know probably on April 27th, we're going to have a fantastic musical program. I think we're naming it Baroque to Folk, Bach, Beer, and Haydn. And it is produced by an organization called Arts Tolerance, and whose leader, Rudy Bar-David, is a cellist with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And it's going to be a wonderful program of music and dialogue around the German Jewish theme. And so we hope that you'll be able to join us. And if you continue to watch our website constantly and without fail, you will eventually see other events that will be going up over the coming weeks and months. I want to say thank yous up front to a number of people. Our German Jewish Heritage Series would not be possible without the partners that we're working with, some of whom are here tonight. I want to thank so much Rabbi Eli Friedman from Rodef Shalom. Rodef Shalom is a fantastic partner. We just did a Shabbat dinner with them just 2 nights ago. Some of you might have been there, and it was amazing, is all I can say. We also want to thank the folks with the Jewish Community Relations Council, including Rabbi David Strauss, who's also here today, and their executive director, Jason Holtzman. I want to do a particular shout out to Marwan Kreide, who I may not have mentioned before, who's the guy who put me in touch with all these fine people, has also been a part of our committee, a former member of our board, and a great guy overall. And finally, well, not even finally, I want to thank Liesel and Rachel. Liesel Jandry, who's over here, our executive director, also without whom none of these things take place, and Rachel Salmon, who's our administrative assistant, who's in the back. These are great people, and I would just really like to have a round of applause for all of them. Today today is also made possible by two very important sponsors. One is the Consulate General of New York, the German Consulate General of New York, and we're going to have someone very shortly who I'll introduce who will be speaking to you, who's made this talk possible through their generous support. And the reception has been sponsored by Alliance of America, who's also sponsoring other parts of this series. And so these are also incredibly important partners, and we are very grateful for all of their support. I want to now just briefly introduce the program, and I would just start by saying Nora Krug is a native of Karlsruhe and is the author of this great book. I see many of you have copies, and the opportunity to buy more copies is right behind us, and she'll be around, also available to sign some of those for you after the program. This is a book that explores her journey in leaving Germany, in connecting with the Jewish community, and beginning to reflect on the meaning of German identity in the post-Holocaust era. I first found out about this book about a little more than a year ago, and somebody who's in the audience today with Philly Kinder basically said, "Oh, Mark, you have to read this book." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, fine." So I got it, and I was like, wow. I already had this idea that we were going to do this series, and part of that series needed to be a reflection on Germany and the impact of the Holocaust on modern Germany as well, and a reflection on identity in modern times. And so this book also reminded me of my previous work with Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. I worked with many, many young German volunteers, and one of their jobs was to ask their parents exactly these kind of questions. And when I read the book, I thought, this is like 8 years of my life in one publication, and another reason why I was thrilled when Nora agreed to come and speak and be with us today. Maiken Scott is also amazing. I've known her for quite some time as a neighbor and as a friend. She is, as many of you know, the host of The Pulse on WHYY-FM. She is also a native of Karlsruhe, and as we just discovered about 15 minutes ago, grew up about a block from Nora. So the world is very, very small. Maiken will also kill me if I don't mention that on February 18th, we have a Fasching dance party that is going to be amazing. It's called Love Parade, a Fastnacht dance party, and it's going to be happening in our Ratskeller. It's a costume, Mardi Gras style thing. Love is in the air, and she is the chairman of that party, and so, Maiken, I've done my duty. And so this is the program that we have ahead of us. And before we begin with Nora, I want to just introduce Anton Klitz, who's the Consul for Political Affairs at the German Consulate in New York. And Anton?
It's gotten tricky now all of a sudden. Lower, maybe? Lower. Closer. Like this. Okay. Is this working? Not yet? No, it's on. It is. It's just sometimes you have to speak loud. Better now? Yes. Yeah. I hope it also works when I lean down to look at my notes. Okay. Haven't been in the US long enough to learn how to speak freely. I'm always very impressed. It's something you don't learn in Germany as well as here. So, good afternoon. It's a privilege for the German Consulate General to support today's event. Thank you, Mark, German Society of Pennsylvania, your partners, Congregation Rodef Shalom, the Jewish Community Relationships Council, and Action Reconciliation Service for Peace for Organizing. Thank you, Nora and Maiken, for being here today and competing with the NFL playoffs. Quite difficult, I guess. So when you look at the idea behind the German Jewish Heritage Series project, it's almost surprising it hasn't been before. So important and timely is the topic. there is such a large and influential German heritage in Pennsylvania, and Jewish heritage in German culture is so relevant, both historically as well as for the present and the future. To look at German Jewish heritage and identity today, and to explore the meaning of German identity in the post-Holocaust world in only 4 events is somewhat ambitious. But I do think you did a good job in choosing the topics in these 4 events. 2 weeks ago with the Jewish-German brewing workshop, definitely a good choice. Beer is always a good approach when we talk about it. Then you had Markus Krug from the Leo Baeck Institute here, someone I have gotten to know very well, very knowledgeable person. To speak about 1,700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands. The exhibition you see here, we also had it in the German House in New York. And then you had a German Jewish Shabbat service and dinner 2 days ago at Holocaust Remembrance Day, 27th of January. And finally today's discussion with Nora Krug, based on her graphic novel Heimat, which she reflects about what it means to be German in her, actually in our generation. The German Jewish history is long and rich. In 321, 1,700, a little bit more years ago, Emperor Constantine the Great granted Jews in Cologne the right to hold public office. His edict marks the oldest document of Jewish life in Europe north of the Alps. There is an exciting and powerful story to be told of Jewish influence and involvement in the arts and sciences, philosophy and religion, politics and economy. There were periods of great success in Jewish entrepreneurship, as well as Jewish German patriotism, resilience, and vibrant Jewish life. Countless names stand for Jewish German creativity and ingenuity, including, of course, Albert Einstein. Caroline Herschel, a 19th century astronomer, was the first woman to receive a salary as a scientist. The entrepreneur Emil Rathenau was crucial to use electricity on an industrial scale. His son, the liberal lawmaker Walter Rathenau, served as German foreign minister during the Weimar Republic. Indeed, Germany was gifted with German Jewish artists, philosophers, politicians, and inventors, as well as with hundreds of thousands of non-famous fellow Jewish citizens who, through their lives and participation, shaped Germany in a unique way. You often read about Jewish contributions to German culture and society. I find it somehow misleading, because Jews in Germany did not contribute as outsiders. They actually formed Germany from the inside as citizens, patriots, members of the society. It is also true that German Jewish history was, throughout the centuries, a very dark one. Jews were scapegoated and the focus of conspiracy theories. They were threatened by pogroms, persecution, culminating in humanity's lowest point, the Holocaust. By erasing Jewish life and pretending to make Germany more German, National Socialists destroyed a huge part of German culture and identity. Today, Germany is home to more than 200,000 Jews again. About 20,000 Israelis live only in Berlin. It took generations of reconciliation to rebuild trust. And we are very thankful for the many hands that were reached out to us and made reconciliation possible. The fact that Jewish life is back in Germany after the Shoah is nothing short of a miracle. Yes, we are proud that Jews have again placed confidence in our country. Jewish life belongs to our country and will forever be part of our culture. Although this may sound like a happy end, of course it is not. Anti-Semitism is rising on the other side of the Atlantic, on this side of the Atlantic. To foster Jewish life in Germany and to fight anti-Semitism is a constant obligation, a responsibility for the whole society. Germany recently established a national strategy against anti-Semitism and for Jewish life. Its main pillars are education, remembrance, and security. The Holocaust is unique, but there is an important message to be learned from it. Never again. Genocide always begins with hate, and there is far too much hate speech to be heard. The most obvious sign for that lessons haven't been learned is the war of Russia against Ukraine. Of course. Constantine's edict is a reminder to initiate cultural, political, and interreligious debates within our society. We are committed to working together in friendship, reconciliation, and trust to help shape the future of the Jewish-German relationship. We are proud to be part of this story. Thank you.
I appreciate those words. It really encapsulates a lot of what this entire program and series is about. So thank you again. Now we're going to discreetly move this microphone onto the stage.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for the invitation and for speaking. I feel very excited to be here. We're going to have a conversation about this book and maybe what came after. But before we do that, I wanted to just give a short reading from the beginning of this book called Belonging, A German Reckons with History at Home. And I hope I can make sense of this remote control. From the notebook of a homesick emigre, Things German, number 1, Hansaplast. Hansaplast is a brand of bandage developed in 1922. My mother applied it to my bleeding knee after a roller skating accident when I was 6 years old. Next to my mother, Hansaplast was the safest thing in the world. No matter if your skin is thick or thin, smooth or wrinkly, dry or moist, Hansaplast is so reliable that it won't come off until your wound has fully healed. It's the most tenacious bandage on the planet, and it hurts when you tear it off to look at your scar. It was one of my very first encounters in New York City. I was standing on the rooftop of my friend's apartment building, the only person I knew so far in the city. I had just moved here from Berlin to study. I didn't know anyone. No one knew me. Everything was possible. An elderly woman sitting in a lounge chair had overheard our conversation. "Where are you from?" she asked me. "I'm from Germany." That's what I thought. "Have you ever been to Germany?" I asked. "Yes, a long, long time ago." She avoided eye contact. And then I understood. She went on to tell me about how she had survived the concentration camp because one of the female Nazi prison guards had rescued her from the gas chamber 14 times at the last moment. The guard, who had exhibited merciless violence toward everyone else in the camp, regularly knocking prisoners' heads together for punishment, had had the elderly woman suspected a secret crush on her. Female prison guards. 16 times on the edge of the gas chamber. 16 times escaping immediate death by a hair's breadth. 16 times seeing others walk to their deaths while you must live. A familiar heat began to form in the pit of my stomach. How do you react as a German, standing across from a human being who reveals this memory to you? I remained silent. "That was a long time ago," she finally said. "I'm sure things have changed. You seem like someone who was raised by loving parents." I nodded. First chapter, early dawning. Our backyard in Karlsruhe, in the south of Germany, faced a US military air base, where planes regularly took off and landed. I heard them hissing and roaring above our house like dangerous animals that had, unbelievably, decided to spare our lives. Part of me understood that something had once gone horribly wrong. 1980s, me and my mother. My brother and I never met any of the American soldiers who, since the end of the war, had been stationed in our town to protect us from resurging Nazism and the threat of communism. But we knew quite a bit about them. Americans chewed gum. They put their feet on tables. They read Donald Duck in bed without taking off their shoes. And they still had the death penalty. They had given chocolate to our Aunt Karin when she came back from evacuation in the countryside after the war. The first chocolate she'd ever had. The Amis, as we call them, cruised the streets in their extravagant fake wood-paneled cars and stopped in for hamburgers at the American supermarket, which we weren't allowed to enter because we didn't have American IDs. We used the word Ami-Schicksal for an American woman with pink fingernails and blonde cotton candy hair, not knowing that the term had originally been used in the 1940s for German women who fraternized with men from the American occupying force. We also didn't know that Schicksal was a Yiddish word, nor, for that matter, what Yiddish was. I don't remember when I first heard the word Konzentrationslager, but I became aware of it long before I learned about the Holocaust. I sensed that concentration camps were sinister places, and I imagined that the people who lived there were forced to concentrate to the point of physical anguish. But I was too afraid to ask, feeling that this was something embarrassing to talk about, something that grown-ups discussed in whispers, something evoking the same unsettling feeling as the man with a hat who sometimes gave candy and balloons to my brother and me when we were playing alone in the front yard. Are Jews evil? I asked my mother one day after coming home from elementary school. It was around the time that I had made it a habit to change into the panther costume she had sewn me for Carnival. Of course they aren't. Who told you that? She stopped stirring and vigorously rubbed her hands dry on her apron. My religion teacher said that it was the Jews who killed Jesus. Not knowing any Jews, I assumed that they didn't exist outside of the Bible. They seemed distant, like a long-extinct species. Experiencing my mother's anger, I concluded that day that Jews, all Jews, were good. One of my favorite books as a child was Der Struwwelpeter, a collection of 19th century illustrated stories about children who get punished for misbehaving. The book was considered outdated because of its moral severity, but my mother happened to keep her old childhood copy on the family bookshelf. The story that stuck with me most was about a girl alone at home with her cats, who plays with matches and burns herself into a heap of ash. The girl's demise was depicted in colorful exaggeration. What the story taught me was that you shouldn't feel sorry for yourself if you were responsible for your own downfall. Thank you. So that's the beginning of the book.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to be here with Nora. And the picture she just showed us of this airfield, it was when I came across that in the book, my eyes almost fell out of my head because obviously I knew we were from the same city, but I grew up looking at that same airfield and flying on that airfield and, you know, getting into trouble on that airfield because it was sort of like a big open space where we were not supposed to be, but we were there anyway, of course. Nora, I want to ask you first about the title of the book, which I read in German. And in German, the title is Heimat, which in my childhood was not really a word we used because it had that sort of that ring of something that, even though I didn't fully understand why the word was somehow bad or old-fashioned, but I knew there was something not quite right about that word because it had that baggage. Can you tell me why you chose it as the title or how you felt about the word?
Well, I had the same feelings about it growing up because the Nazis, it was one of those German words that the Nazis appropriated for their own use, obviously. And so after the war, we had all these Heimat movies in the 50s that came out at a time when Germany was completely ignorant to its own terrible actions, and it was only in the 60s when these difficult conversations started. And then in the 60s forward, from the 60s forward, the word became more and more associated with just negative connotations. But it's also a very important word, not only to Germans, but really across, I mean, for any culture, because it describes the place where you feel you most belong or that most formed you and your worldview. And so it's an important word, and I used it as a working title initially for the book. And my American publisher wanted to use it first as a title, and my German publisher was completely against it for the reasons that you mentioned. But then, during the 6 years of my working on the book, the political landscape in Germany began to change, and the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the right-wing political party, became quite popular and got a lot of votes, and at that point my German publisher completely changed their mind, and they basically said that we have to call it Heimat because in Germany, in the current cultural landscapes, it's only right-wing people who think that they can and should celebrate German identity, and we have to reclaim that term from them. So it was a political act in a way to say, wait a minute, it's not only right-wing people who are allowed to use this term or to express, a cultural identification, but it's also those of us who believe that we have to continuously look back at the past and at what we have done so that it never happens again, and that those two things should not necessarily be a contradiction. And it was really a way of reclaiming the term from the extreme right, basically.
You describe a sentiment in the book where, when you moved here, you started to wrestle with your identity as a German in a new way, which I think happens to a lot of people who move away. You suddenly become aware that you are different, and you start to think about, well, who am I? And growing up as a German, I never thought about what it meant to be German for me. I thought a lot about our past. I thought about what had happened, but I didn't think of myself as a German until I came here, and people were like, oh, you're so German. I'm like, how am I German? And it was like the first time in my life where I really thought about, beyond always being on time, but it was like the first time I thought about what this meant, and I felt that with your book, that you really began to sort of wrestle with that question.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think when you leave your home country and move abroad, the distance allows you to get closer in a strange way. And I think what's also interesting in America, I don't know what it's like in Pennsylvania, but in New York, as a German, I had a lot of negative responses from when I moved there 20 years ago. And of course it's because it was a major entry point for refugees during the Second World War. And then when I went to the Midwest, to give lectures and stuff like that, I was welcomed with open arms in a way that I was actually uncomfortable with, because I felt like, in some communities that I visited, actually as part of the research for my book, in Milwaukee, there was a sense that we should dwell on the Holocaust, and that was, a German perspective that was very different from mine, because growing up in Western Germany, obviously we had this post-war education, Holocaust education, and I suddenly encountered Germans who hadn't gone through that process and had just looked at it from afar. And so I think it really depends also on where in America or in the world. I think how you're seen also impacts obviously the way how you think about yourself. So it's not just that you think about your heritage, but however you're approached about it also brings out different associations in you. And for me, that was what propelled me to write the book, because I often felt, obviously for understandable reasons, that there was a lot of negative sentiment.
As you started to dig into your own family's history, what were you most afraid of finding? Like, before you knew what you would find, what was sort of the worst thing you could think about?
It's interesting, because often people ask me whether I was afraid, and I don't remember feeling ever afraid. I think my curiosity was so strong, and the need to confront the topic, that I wasn't really thinking about what would happen. I just felt like I owed it to myself, to my family, to my new country, to my new family. I owed it, the truth. I needed to know the truth. And I expected not to find out that any of my family members were high-ranking Nazis, because I would have known at that point. High-ranking Nazis are so much has been written about them, that I think it's very difficult not to know when you grow up in those families. But I didn't know really what my grandparents had done or not done. Yeah.
I want to talk about your mother's father and what you learned in sort of researching him, because there were some conflicting stories a little bit about his past and what he had done. So talk a little bit about Willie.
Yeah, so it's him, the guy on the left, and he grew up in my hometown. He was a car mechanic, which was a very unusual job at the time, because there weren't many cars. And Karlsruhe was actually one of the places where I think Benz came from Karlsruhe. So it was one of the places that actually had a couple of cars. And so he learned how to repair them, and he then became a chauffeur. And he was a chauffeur for a Jewish man, a linen salesman, who actually went to the countryside to sell linens to women who were hoping to get married as a dowry. And so that was his job, and he worked for this man for a long time, and then at some point that man, we don't know what year that was, said to him that he had to leave. And he gave my grandfather some money as a way of showing his gratitude. That's the story I had been told. That's the thing with family histories, that we just repeat these stories without actually questioning them. And we have no proof for anything that we're being told about our families. And then I was told that during the war he was a driving teacher for soldiers, and that's why he never had to go to the front. And he always said to my mother that he never carried a gun. So that was always a very comfortable, family narrative to be told as a child. And at some point there was also a story about him having hidden a Jewish friend in the garden shed in a neighborhood that was actually bombed. So even if he had hidden somebody, there's no proof that they would have survived. But I don't even think that was actually true, the hiding part. So part of the goal was to find out as many facts as I could to actually see whether any of this was true. And that's when I started going into archives and trying to find information.
Yeah, and you found he was a member of the party. And that was a surprise to you on some level, right? Because the family had always said he had been a social democrat, he had voted social democrat, so how did you wrestle with that finding?
Yeah, I mean, I actually believe that he was a social democrat and that he voted for the social democrats, but the whole thing is just so complex. What does it mean to be in the Nazi party? Does it mean that you're a Nazi? Then what about those people who, even people like Rommel, who never joined the Nazi party, but he was one of the most high-ranking people involved in this whole terror. So it's very difficult to think about what does it actually mean. So it came as a shock to my entire family because he had always been a social democrat, and the social democrats was actually the biggest political enemy of the Nazis because the second strongest party. And when I went to the archive, I found a file. So after the war, in the western sections, you were every German over 18 years of age had to fill out a questionnaire, and the questionnaire came with, I think, 400 questions, and you had to basically write down what you had done under the Nazi regime, and then based on the answers you gave, you were ranked into 5 different categories. So the worst was major war criminal, then you were like a minor war criminal, or whatever that means. Then you were, I forgot the exact names, but the lowest one was, being innocent or a victim under the regime, and then the next one was being a follower, and Mitläufer. And so I found that file, I found those questions that he had filled out, and to see that after almost 80 years, a file that probably nobody had looked at in 80 years, because nobody in my family had done this research, and to see his own handwriting, in blue ink, to fill out, those questions, it was such a strange, intimate, but also uncomfortable feeling, because I felt like he was suddenly talking to me and answering all these questions that I had all throughout my youth. I mean, my grandparents were all dead by the time I was 8, so I never had a chance to ask them directly, and this was my dialogue with him from the grave.
And you found letters that people had written for him to sort of vouch for him and his character, right?
Yeah, so what happened, they were referred to as Persil-Scheine, so Persil certificates, because Persil is a famous brand of a laundry detergent, and basically it meant that somebody could wash you clean by writing you a reference letter, even if you had done terrible things under the Nazi regime. So so what happened in his case was that he was first ranked as some sort of low-ranking culprit, based on the fact that he joined the Nazi party in 1933, which was very early on. I mean, that was kind of unusual. And then he tried to make a case for himself. He wanted to just be a follower. And in order to do that, he had to collect proof. I mean, I'm using this the whole time because it's not really proof, but that's when he asked his former employees and employers and friends to write him these letters vouching for his innocence. Yeah.
And you found some of the people who you then went looking to find the people who had written those letters.
Yeah, so one letter was written by the husband of a Jewish woman who he was friends with, and what the letter said was that even though the Nazis did not want non-Jewish people to interact with Jewish people, he stayed friends with them all throughout that time. And while that's not relieving him of any, I still don't think he had to join the party. I mean, maybe I should say the reason for why he joined the party was because he bought a driving school that had the car of the highest-ranking Nazi parked in it, and the guy who owned the driving school told him he could only buy it if he joined the party. Does that mean he had to join the party? Yeah. I don't think it does. But it was his decision. But anyway, the letter I found was written by his friend, and whose wife actually survived Theresienstadt and eventually returned to my hometown.
Yeah, and I think I struggled with this a lot especially when I was younger, is to think, what would I have done? And I found that sort of reflected in a lot of these stories where, as humans, we are put in positions where we can be brave, we can be extraordinarily brave, or we can maybe just, get along and keep our profile low, or worse yet, we can participate in terrible things. But it's sort of, what I felt like the book really does beautifully, it brings these decisions and these everyday sort of occurrences that humans are part of really into the forefront. And we don't know what we would have done, right?
I mean, I think that's probably the basic question of the book, but what I find is that people often too quickly resort to this idea that people didn't have a choice. You know, when I started working on the book and people asked me about it, and I told them that, you know, my grandfather was in the Nazi party, in order to make me feel better, I mean, in America, they kept on saying, oh, I don't know what I would have done. And I think it's just, people always have a choice, and we have a choice now too, and I think we tend to forget that, and that's dangerous because, you know, the other thing is that there were so many ways in which you could actually do something, even ways that would have not endangered yourself or your family. You know, there were small things like warning your Jewish neighbors, sharing food stamps with them. So, you know, you can help in many small ways if you're not brave enough to sacrifice your life. And you also, there's a point in any totalitarian regime, when we look at it, you know, with Russia at the moment, where you do have to ask yourself, can I go and live in a country that, do I want my children to grow up in a country like that? I mean, where you simply feel propelled to do something no matter what happens. But if you don't feel brave enough to do that, I do think you still have a choice to do something. And the sad truth is that most people didn't do anything. And that's what's really uncomfortable to talk about. And I think something that I realized and that I wrote a little bit about in the book also is that in school, I don't know if it was your experience as well, we didn't learn much about the German resistance movement. I forgot how many Germans died for resisting the regime. It's not really talked about, I mean, neither in Germany nor abroad. I mean, of course, it was a fraction of the general society, but it existed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a handful of people. I mean, thousands of people died for resisting the regime. And, you know, then I wondered, are we not talking about this? Because then our own grandparents who didn't do anything would have really looked bad in comparison. And I think we need to hold ourselves up to that standard. You know, we shouldn't be too quick in saying, I don't know what I would have done, because if nobody does anything, we see what happens, and we see it with Russia now too.
Yeah. Your grandfather's brother, Edwin, he died as a soldier, and to me, one of the most touching parts of the book is reading his letters, which you found, and sort of seeing him fade away, which you bring beautifully into perspective by literally having his portrait sort of fade away. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So talk a bit about what you found out about Edwin and what touched you most about that.
Yeah, so he, before the war, he married a Swiss woman, and I think he was Mason. And his work brought him to Switzerland, so he married a Swiss woman, and obviously Switzerland is always neutral. And so he didn't have to go. He thought he was basically safe, and he applied for Swiss citizenship. But I think at that point, I don't know what it's like now, but it took a long time for him to get it. And just a few months before he was supposed to get Swiss citizenship, he was called to the front as a German soldier. And he didn't want to go at all. He didn't like Hitler. He was a very emotional person, I think much more so than my grandfather. His letters are actually quite poetic and almost literary and very moving. And I had never read them before I worked on the book. My relatives in Switzerland had them and sent them to me. And I really braced myself because I was prepared to read, I collect a lot of these letters from the front line when I go to Germany and I visit flea markets. I collect these things because to me they're silent witnesses of the war, and they tell personal stories, and a lot of these stories are very uncomfortable to read because they talk about Germany's heroic acts and I was bracing myself to read the same kind of language in his letters, but they were just about his love for his wife and children, and I know that you've that you've pickled the vegetables for me in the basement. I wonder if I'll ever eat them. And then, you know, the months go by and the letters become more and more longing. And at some point he writes that he really, you know, that this is what's expected of humans on both sides is inhumane, and there's nowhere any of the soldiers can go at this point, neither them nor the Russians. And then, yeah, and then the letters just stopped and he disappeared, and we still don't know how he died.
And you have the letter that informs the family that he went missing. And there is a part in the book which is, I'm looking at it in German, but I'm going to try to translate it on the spot, which is this page here. If you also have the book. Oh, good. But no chance I can read it. Can you read it? Sorry. My eyes are not going to go that far.
I mean, maybe I can just briefly...
Here, or I can say what it says. You know, it basically says, finally, my feelings are catching up with me. For the first time, I feel the sadness of the loss which my family suffered. And because of this sadness, I feel the gap between me and Willie disappear, right? So you're talking about your grandfather who lost his younger brother here, who he had raised to some large extent, right? And there is a sentiment there that I feel was often lost to me too, because my own family never spoke about what they had gone through during the war, because I think it paled in comparison to what Germany had perpetrated, and there was a lot of shame about what Germans had perpetrated. But this suffering and this loss is still so real and so deep, and it really like punched me when I saw this page, and I think you felt that too.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult thing because I mean, even now, I don't allow myself to feel this loss or sadness, because I really feel like, I mean, that's what the whole Struwwelpeter episode was about, obviously, that it was our, you know, it's a trauma, but it's a self-induced trauma.
It's our doing, right?
Yeah, and so it's difficult to talk about, but then what happens to a society that never reflects on that? I think that's also dangerous, because that's again something that the extreme right then picks up on. And then you have the same thing that happens here, where people then end up saying, oh, I'm tired of always being the guilty one, and we suffer too, and you know, it goes into the opposite direction, because there was no natural way of actually talking about those emotions. And we mentioned this earlier at the library, that we actually never talked, when in history class or German class, when we talked about the Holocaust, and we went to many, I mean, I went to quite a few concentration camp museums in school, but the teachers never asked us how we were feeling. You know, we saw the gas chambers and the photographs and everything, and we came out, and no conversations about how this made us feel. And I think that's a huge oversight, educational oversight. I think you have to be able to admit to the fact that you feel, you know, you feel a shame, you feel a guilt. It's also mourning. You mourn your country, because how can you ever embrace your own country again that's done something like that? And what does it mean to grow up in a country that you can't love? I mean, it's a very unnatural, difficult thing to be put in when you're born after, you know, after that. But you have to talk about it, and of course apply it to the present time too.
You also tell us the story of another relative who died in the war, which was your dad's older brother. So talk a bit about him, and you had like so little sense of who he had been, and his life was so short that it's almost hard to get a full picture of him, because his life had been cut so short.
Yeah, so that was the guy on the left, and he grew up in a village in Franconia, and he was 18 when he was drafted into the SS, as you can see on his uniform. And apparently he ended up there because there was a time where they basically people were drafted into it. I think at the beginning, I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think at the beginning it was a matter of choice, but then later it was more. And he, I mean, the first time I ever heard about him was that my parents had in an old cupboard in the living room, they had his old school exercise books that he adorned with illustrations, as they used to do back then. And some of the pages were adorned with swastikas and other, terrible images, and anti-Semitic caricatures. And there was one terrible story that I talk about in the book that was called "The Jew, a Poisonous Mushroom." And it actually it comes from a book that was given out by the Nazis for free to children. I forgot what year. Der Stürmer published it. And he basically retold the story from that book. I don't know if the teacher asked them to do that or if it was his idea. And then he illustrated it, with mushrooms that had faces in them. And that's why the mushroom is a symbol that I refer to over and over in the book. It's kind of a recurring symbol in my story on the right pages. My mother dressed as a poisonous mushroom after the war, which is it's just so complex. The mushroom is a sign of good luck, the poisonous mushroom, but it also kills you. Then you have that anti-Semitic story. Then your own mother is dressed as a poisonous mushroom. And what does that say about a culture? Those are the things that I'm always curious about. And anyway, I found these exercise books with these horrible stories, and that's how I first was introduced to him. And then, my father was, he died in Italy at age 19, so he was in the war for 1 year and died in Italy. And one day on a family vacation to Italy, which we used to go to every summer when I was a child, we came across a German military cemetery that somebody had told us about, but we didn't know anything about it. We went in there, and by chance we found his grave, because my father went up to the chapel and went through the names and looked for his own name, because he was actually named after his dead brother, because he was born after his brother's death. And we found my father's name in this register and found the grave. And it was just it left such an imprint on me at the time. And so he was like he had a shadowy existence all throughout my life. And the only person that's still alive who knew him is my father's sister, who my father had a fallout 40 years ago. So they hadn't spoken in decades, and I had never met her. And so part of the book tells the story of how I go back to my father's village to meet her for the first time, to learn everything I could learn about this uncle. And again, it's just all about these connections and disconnections, and to bond with a woman who my father has no connection with anymore over the death of this guy who was in the SS. It's just so, it's so many strange emotions that come up when that happens.
Did you walk away feeling like you had a more three-dimensional picture of this person?
A little bit. People always say, he couldn't have been blamed for writing that story. Yes, maybe he was asked to write it, maybe every student in the class wrote the same story. But I do think, he was, I forgot how old, I think 15 or 14 when he wrote the story. I do think at that age, we do expect, children to know that Jews or other minorities or whoever are not, poisonous. That it's just, it's shocking. At that age, you're supposed to know that this is, propaganda. Again, maybe he was told to write the story, but I have to say I felt less sympathy for him than for my grandfather's brother who vanished in Russia, because because some of the letters that he wrote from the front line were a little bit more, just the language he wrote, the way he wrote about Italians, and it was a little bit more the kind of language that one would expect from a German soldier at that time, and that didn't make me feel much more sympathetic towards him.
You also trace some of the fates of the Jewish populations, especially in the town where your dad grew up and such. So what did you find there, and how did people react to your quest to want to document that?
Yeah, it's interesting when I tell people here about the book, there's often this idea that it's still a taboo. I think that talking about what your own family has done is still a taboo, but I think that it's not a taboo to talk about the war and the Holocaust. We talked about it all the time in school. So It wasn't, I mean, nobody was shocked that I was doing this work, but of course it's a small village, and so everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody's grandparents and great-grandparents, and everybody knows who the Nazi was in this village, and that, you know, it's the collected memory is just much more present and preservable than it is in a city like Karlsruhe, where people come and go. And so, of course, there is the one family that an electrician burned down the synagogue at the time. He was doing electrical work and took that as an opportunity to burn down the synagogue. And that family still has, you know, an electrical company in that town. And it's just funny when you then, I had to actually, I know somebody, a Jewish man who lives in New Jersey and whose mother fled from the same village. And he was also, in the 80s, he started this work of going to this village and filming people and interviewing people, and back then it was a much bigger issue. And then his batteries ran out from his camera, and he had to go to that electrical shop to buy. It's just the reality of post-war, you know, post-war German experiences, all these little, so I met a few people who could tell me a little bit about my family. I had, you know, lunch with them at the beer garden that used to belong to my great-grandparents. It was a very interesting and important experience, and I think it is so important when you go to the actual physical place where history happens, because I think it makes you understand it in a very different way, and that was true for that village as well.
If you look back on what you set out to do with this book, what would you say it was? What was the driving force behind you doing this book, if you really had to crystallize it?
I think it was my guilt. I mean, I really feel like I grew up with an abstract sense of guilt. That was a collective sense of guilt. Because as what I said before, that we learned so much about the Holocaust but weren't taught how to deal with it emotionally. And how to apply it to the present. I mean, if we had been told to, okay, now apply what you've learned to the immigrant community in Karlsruhe and volunteer, or, you know, we would have felt like we had some agency, but we just sat there listening to the terrible things we had done. And that was very important. It was very important that we listened to that, but it didn't go beyond that. And so I think, and then when I came to New York, I just felt like, well, now I'm a representative of my country, and when you're a representative of Germany, you're always a representative of, you know, German recent history, because it's just the way it is. Everybody associates Germany with that. And so I felt like I need to do something. I can't, you know, I didn't even know what my family had done. How could I ever talk to anybody here if they asked me if my family was involved or what their position was? And so I felt like I needed to return, and it really needed this distance in order for me to take the first step. I mean, I always quote Hannah Arendt, who said, where everybody's guilty, no one is, and I think that's a feeling that a lot of Germans have when they stay in Germany, is that, well, everybody else around you on the street, their parents were probably also followers or Nazis or whatever, and so it becomes less, it's just not an extraordinary thing, and then you don't reflect on it. And I think it's very important that we reflect on it in an individual level, because you can really hide behind the collective. And I think collective memory and commemoration is very important. I mean, I'm not saying it's not. I mean, institutionally, the work you're doing here and all that is extremely important, but it's as important to do it individually, because otherwise it could end up just being a gesture, and I think you have to feel it. You have to feel it. I think it also makes you more responsible as an individual when you learn about your own family.
I think it is also important, though, to think about how people do get ground up in the wheels of history, and especially reading about your grandfather's brother. There is that sense of, history sometimes is this force, is this wave that swallows us up, no matter, which side of history we're on. But people do get just like plowed under by what happens. And I think allowing yourself to feel that grief and allowing yourself to think about what it must have been like to be a mother during that time, what it must have been like to try to raise children, knowing that this war was coming. That was something I never allowed myself to think about, and I get choked up just saying this, because I think about my grandmother, and I never asked her, what was that like? Because I didn't think it was okay to ask her. So I do appreciate your book on many levels. And I want to take a turn to think about what you've done since. You have sort of stuck on the topic of tyranny or of political forces that are so big and so terrible that they tend to swallow us up. So talk a bit about your next two projects that have come since.
Yeah, so the American historian Timothy Snyder had graciously written a quote for the back of my book, Belonging. I mean, as you probably know, that's an American tradition is to ask people for blurbs, as we call them, to advertise the book. And so he had written one, and then after that he asked me if I wanted to illustrate his already existing book, On Tyranny, which came out in response to Donald Trump becoming the President of the United States. So he published that in 2017. And his publisher had always wanted him to do a visual version of it because they were hoping that it would attract a younger readership. I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I actually think we as adults, all humans are visual people. We never ask ourselves with movies, they're just for children. I mean, it's strange to me that we somehow think, oh, we can watch a movie, a fiction movie about the war, but then when it's an illustrated book, it's suddenly, oh, I don't read graphic novels. I mean, it's, we are visual, and, images can communicate so much about war and memory culture and everything. Anyway, so I said yes, obviously, because I admire the work he does, but also it seemed like a natural continuation because his book is about tyranny and how, places, countries, systems can bit by bit descend into tyranny without us really noticing it, and what we can do as individuals to prevent that from happening. And it's a book of 20 lessons. Do not obey in advance, defend institutions, beware the one-party state, take responsibility for the face of the world, remember professional ethics. So these are the chapter titles, and then he lays out, using examples, what to look out for and how these things happen in history and how we can prevent them from happening again.
And talk about the project you're working on now, which is ongoing.
Yeah, I just clicked to put too many images together. So when the war in Ukraine began, or when Russia invaded Ukraine, the war is really, war in general is really the subject that I'm mostly interested in, and I think it is because I'm German. But before I did Belonging, I actually had published a series of non-fiction biographies of people who experienced war but who are more or less unknown because they're neither heroes nor major war criminals, so they're kind of falling into the middle, like my grandfather too. Now with this new war, I just felt like I wanted to document something that was happening in real time. So I reached out to the few people I know in Russia and Ukraine, people I actually had only had one conversation with previously, and asked them, how are you feeling? And their response was so personal and so, it just made it for me so much more real to read their brief messages. Of course, the historic and the political facts are extremely important that we read about, but we often don't get a sense of what does this mean to individuals. I mean, we sometimes get articles that are one-off articles about somebody who experienced something, and then we are left wondering what had happened to that person. Is he or she still alive? And so I wanted to do something that I could follow, I wanted to follow two people over the course of months And so what I did is I ended up working with a Ukrainian journalist and a Russian artist, and I have been interviewing them every week since the beginning of the war about their personal experiences, and then illustrated whatever they told me. And because what I'm really interested in, and this is really true for my other books too, is what war does with us as individuals. What are the small moments? I mean, for instance, in the first week, she's talking about the first thing that she did when she heard that Russia invaded Ukraine was to take a bath, because taking a bath to her is always a way of calming herself down. And then when she reports from the front line, obviously there's no bathtub, so then returning to a safer place is always the place where she can take a bath, but then during the blackouts there was no warm water. So, these details that give us a sense of what does it mean on a day-to-day basis. She was in Kiev some weeks ago, and her apartment is on the 20th floor, and she just couldn't get up there during the blackout, so she had to wait in her car for hours until she could go up, and go to sleep, basically. So these are the small things that we don't usually read about, but that I think make everything so much more human, in a way. And so that's what, and these strips have been published in various newspapers, but mostly in the NA Times, and are going to be published in book form this year, in August.
Mm-hmm. And I guess there's the theme that history is not just the big history, it's the little details, people's lives, people's stories, those letters, the things you found, and it's what is happening now. We often look back and think, well, that's history, what happened then, but it's also what is happening, like, in this moment that you're documenting.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you walk around in Philadelphia and you see all these signs, it's wonderful, but at the same time, there's something very static about it, and almost a little propagandistic sometimes, because it's so, it focuses very much on the positive, obviously, that's what these signs are there for. But we talked about the Stumbling Stone project earlier, which is this project across Germany where an artist embeds cobblestones, brass cobblestones, in the ground of the buildings where Jewish people were deported from under the Nazi regime. And the cobblestones mention the person's name, their date of birth and death, or when they disappeared, and where they, if it's known, where they died. And to me, that's an example for a wonderful, interaction with history, because you literally stumble. I mean, you don't literally because they're not elevated, but you're not
across it. Yeah.
You don't think about it, and then suddenly you see this, and this is the exact house where somebody was deported from. And if I had stood here 80 years ago, would I have done something, or not? What would I have looked this person in the eye? How would that have made me feel? And it just makes it very emotional and personal.
I want to thank you so much for being here today and for being part of this event series. And I think what your book does most beautifully, for me anyway, is the idea of continuous wrestling with history that is often uncomfortable, that is painful, that is difficult, but we have to continue to think about it. We have to continue to talk about it and also honor our own emotions about it and whatever sadness comes with it, but the conversation has to continue for us to be able to move into a hopefully better future. So thank you for this work you've done, for the work you're doing here to document what's happening in Ukraine, and thank you all for being here. And I think Mark will...
We thank Maiken. What a wonderful discussion. I will say, Timothy Snyder is somebody who I follow on Twitter and whose course I've been watching, and I think, wow, how amazing that you actually get to work with him on this topic. So thank you again. I want to basically invite you all in a moment to come and join us for some sweets, for some coffee and tea over at the bar. We're going to have some wine and beer and soft drinks, and you'll have some time to look at the book, perhaps have it signed by our author, take a look at this exhibit on its last day, and so we invite you to stay for a little while for that. But before we close, I want to turn this over to David Strauss. Rabbi Strauss is a member of the committee. Is a member of our committee who's been putting this program together, the former rabbi at Mainline Reform Temple, and also with the Jewish Community Relations Council. And
thanking Nora and Maiken. This was just a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And Nora. So as we heard, there'll be an opportunity for us to be able to mingle. There's some food, some beer, some wine, a chance to be able to look at the exhibit. I have to tell you, for me, these last 6 months have been my own form of homecoming. I have a similar story from my mother that I'd love to be able to share with you at some point and see if you want to write it up. You know, the history of Jews in Germany, of German Jews, is a complex history. It's not just about the Shoah, although certainly the Shoah is an important part of that history. But as this exhibit is about, we have a 1,700-year rich history, and as families are complex and never straightforward, and the narratives we tell about our families always contain a certain amount of truth and a certain amount of hope and dream and a certain amount of fantasy. So too, our shared history is a complex history. Mark mentioned it at the beginning. This is not the end of the programming that we want to do together. So he mentioned about We and Our Tolerance in April 27th. It's a Thursday evening, but it'll be about 7 o'clock, a wonderful concert. But it's going to be a different kind of concert. Our Tolerance, whose board I serve on, believes that the arts offer a unique way to be able to engage in dialogue and of learning about one another. So this will not be a passive experience of just sitting and listening to music, but invite you who are here into dialogue about what you're experiencing, what you heard, and to be able to share your own story about who you are and how arts can help us explore and unpack that. We're also planning a movie night, probably in March, and also in March, 2 colleagues from Germany, one from Berlin, who serves as a rabbi in Berlin to the Jewish community there, another in a smaller town in Hamlin, are going to be with us on Zoom to be able to share the complex story of modern German Jewish identity. What does it mean to be a Jew in Germany today? Who is the German Jewish community today? And what are their successes and what are their struggles? So those are just some of the programs that we're planning over the next couple of months. Thank you all for coming. Now I'm who doesn't watch the Eagles. And thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.
Now, there's so many things that people can't say during their lifetime.